Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a pretty simple review because I'm just looking at one set of IEMs for a change rather than a whole bunch. I will provide a comparison of course as always, but today we're just focusing on the CCA CA24 earphones. The CA24s are a $138 multi-balanced armature IEM, specifically a 12 balanced armature per side IEM, hence the name CA24 referring to a total of 24 drivers between the left and the right earpieces. These have been kindly sent to me for review by Hi-Fi Go, so thank you very much Hi-Fi Go for sending these out, and I have to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with them. But before I give too much away, let's jump in and have a closer look at the CCA CA24. If you've watched my hyper budget IEM battle video where I compared a whole lot of sub $50 IEMs, you'll know that the CCA CSN model came out on top despite having a very teeny tiny price tag. So coming into this, I already knew that I quite liked what CCA were capable of, but I had no sense of what to expect from the CA24. Straight out of the box, a few things are similar to the CSN and a few things are different. The most obvious things I noticed are that the design language is consistent and similar in the sense that we've still got a smoked grey shell. It's a lovely moulded sort of pseudo custom type shell with a metal nozzle on it. And then there's also this aluminium looking faceplate. Now in the case of the CCA CA24, everything is much better built compared to the CSN. So you're definitely getting an upgrade in build quality for the money you're spending. The CA24 also has this slightly kind of raised and rounded front plate. I'm assuming that's to make space for the 12 different balanced armatures in here. And all in all, it's a subtle but very nice looking IEM. I'd say it looks and feels about what I would expect for $140 odd US, so it's not special in any particular way, but it's definitely good enough. Where I think I was a bit let down though by the CA24 is the cable quality is pretty cheap. And I'm going to share with you an example in a moment to show you what I do expect for that sort of money, and also the tip selection is fairly basic too. Now I should be really clear, the tips provided actually seal very well and are comfortable, they just don't feel like the most quality tips and there's not very many options. So I feel like the accessories kind of let the CA24 down a little bit, but the build quality of the earpieces themselves is really nice, for the price at least. I found them very comfortable consistently, even using the stock tips, and that's not always true of a lot of IEMs. And so all in all, I'd call it somewhat of a wash in terms of build quality, accessories, etc. I'm a little bit disappointed on one hand, completely satisfied on the other, and the end result is an IEM that I'm happy with at the $138 price tag. Before I talk about sound quality though, I do just want to contrast what I'm talking about with build quality and accessories. I've recently reviewed a whole bunch of planar magnetic IEMs, and one such IEM was the Shuoer S12. This is the Shuoer S12 here, and it's just $7 more than the CA24. And yet at that price, you're getting a lovely quality cable in terms of its feel. It's got a 4.4mm balanced connection, it's got great quality terminations, it's a nice thick cable without being unwieldy, and then you're also getting solid metal housings. So this is kind of for me what the standard has become for anything in that $140 odd price range. And that's where I do find the CA24s just a little bit of a letdown. The tips for the S12 are also, in my opinion, a little bit better than the CA24. Eagle-eyed viewers will notice that I've got the spiral dots on there, but that's not because the tips are bad, it's just that the spiral dots give me a more consistent fit than almost any other tip. And that's just for my ears. It doesn't mean they're the best chip on the market, they just seem to suit me well. So having clarified why I feel like the CA24 is a little bit of a letdown in terms of accessories, but reminding you that in terms of comfort and general build quality, I think they're excellent, albeit not metal like the S12s, but still excellent, and comfort is probably a little bit better from the CA24s. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about the sound quality of the CA24. And I want to start off by mentioning the tips. I can't stress enough with IEMs how important tips are. During the course of this review, I tried some different tips on the CA24, and without realising it, it deeply influenced my perception of these IEMs. At one point during my note-taking, you were going to hear a version of this review where I talked about the fact that tonally they were a little bit off, and that they don't quite have the level of quality and refinement of something like the S12. But then I remembered how much I'd enjoyed them when I first listened to them with their stock tips. So I put the stock tips back on, and lo and behold, they transformed back into the lovely IEM that I tried when I first received them. And I share that to say that if you're in a position where you're trying out IEMs, maybe you're hearing something vastly different from the reviewer, then there's two possibilities. Either the reviewer used a set of tips that weren't a good fit, or you might be using a set of tips that aren't a perfect fit. And actually there is a third option, and that is that we're all very different. Our ear anatomy and our perceptions can be quite different. So sometimes it's just that the way an IEM fits in my ear or another reviewer's ear could be different to how it fits in yours. So I do want to make that clear. IEMs are probably more difficult in many ways than headphones because they rely entirely on things like the insertion depth and the shape and length of the ear canal. So with all that said, let me share with you my experiences of the CA24 with the right ear tips. When listening to these in isolation, the things I noticed was that the CA24 has a lovely sense of treble extension without going over the top in any way in the treble. Sibilance is controlled well, but there's still a good sense of detail and clarity across the board. Likewise, bass has punch and presence, but it's not over the top. These are a warmer, richer and punchier earphone, but they're not crazy bass monsters that mess up all the rest of the frequency response as a result. I'd also describe the staging as generally pretty good. There's a decent sense of width in the soundstage, not a huge amount of depth, but everything has a good sense of separation and general space around it. That said, I would describe the imaging as just average. It's about what I'd expect for this sort of an earphone. It's not exceptional in any way, but it's solid. And as part of that, depth and layering is also fairly limited. There is a small sense of depth, but not as much as a higher end IEM can provide. Ultimately, as I listened to these casually in preparation for this review, what I found with the CA24 was that with the right tips on it, it was just a consistently enjoyable listen. It's both relaxing and engaging. There's nothing too forward, nothing overly energetic, but at the same time, it's also not overly smoothed off or lacking in speed and clarity and articulation. It's, in my opinion, a pretty perfect balance in many ways. These probably aren't so much a critical listening IEM, as I'll talk about in a moment, but they're very much a musical enjoyment IEM, and that's not a backhanded compliment. That's not a gentle way of saying they're soft and mushy and crappy. That's a way of saying these are an IEM that if I was reaching for something to put on an album and thoroughly enjoy the music, this is an earphone I would reach for. In contrast, I'm going to talk about the S12 from Shuoer in a moment, and that's a little bit different. That's less about pure enjoyment and can get more into making me want to focus critically on what I'm listening to. So both have their place, and I'll try to demonstrate now with some comparisons what I mean about the two. I've already mentioned that the Shuoer S12 I think has better accessories, maybe better build quality, not quite as good comfort, but it's probably an overall better package in terms of the perception of value. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the better earphone, but if you were to unpack both at once, you would think that the Shuoer S12 costs more than the CA24. When we get to listening to different music with them both, the differences continue, but it becomes less about which one's better or which one's worse, and just where they excel on their own individual merits. I'm going to talk you through 3 different tracks with very different types of sound, recording, genre, to give you a really good picture, hopefully, of how these IEMs compare. The first track I took notes on is Rain Check by Ani DiFranco, and listening to that track through the CA24s, there's this wonderful sense of warmth and richness and soul, but also, as I've already alluded to, articulation and clarity as well. They strike a really nice balance. Ani DiFranco's guitar has both attack but also richness. Most of this is played in quite a low register on the guitar, and you can really hear kind of the harmonics and the body of the notes as she plays, but also the twang and the pluck of each string. Likewise, when you focus in on the vocals, her vocals have body and presence, but also air and texture to them as well. Finally, there's a good sense of the room in the recording. You can hear the space she's in, but it's mostly left to right. There's not a great sense of depth, as I've already mentioned. Jumping over to the Shuoer S12, and comparatively with the CA24, the S12 is a much brighter presentation. The S12 isn't an overly bright IEM on its own, but it definitely shows a contrast with the more coloured CA24. Everything from the S12 is more textured and more airy, but at the same time, you're trading that off for a lack of body and presence in the guitar. And I mean that relatively. I don't mean that the S12 sounds bad and particularly lacking in body, but between the two, there's a very clear contrast. What that means is that from the S12, those guitar plucks that I spoke about before have more attack and more texture, but it actually feels a little bit overdone sometimes from the S12. And I really like the S12. If you've seen my Play an IEM battle video, you'll know how much I liked them. But for me, I do think the S12 just balances the tonality of that guitar better. Having said that, I think if you're after technicalities, clarity, and details, you might be willing to trade off that tiny bit of naturality that you get from the CA24 for a sense of greater technicalities from the S12. And this is where the differences lie between these two. As I said before, the CA24 is what I consider an excellent example of a musical and enjoyable IEM, whereas the S12 leans more into the technicalities while still being lots of fun to listen to. It just depends on your taste and how you like to listen to your music. To continue painting that picture, let's talk about the next track I tried, and it's Code Red by AC/DC. This time I had the S12s in my ears when I started, and immediately the cymbals in this track were just a bit too much from the S12. There was more treble energy than I think the track needed. Other than those cymbals, the S12s brought a good sense of attack and clarity to the music, and they did still have just enough bass to be foot tapping and engaging on a rocking track like this. As you might expect though from what I've already said and the frequency responses that you've seen, is that when I moved over to the CA24, they were much more punchy and rhythmic on this sort of music. I did feel like the cymbals from the CA24 were still a touch tinny. It wasn't quite as overdone as it was from the S12, but there's a bit of extra upper treble emphasis in the CA24, and it did come out to play a bit here. It just overbalanced the tonality of those cymbals, and I think it also left the sound of the vocals just a tiny bit off natural. It wasn't bad enough to get in the way of general enjoyment, but listening critically, I don't think either IEM was really perfect on this track. Both had their own issues, but overall on a rhythmic, driving, rock or blues type track like Code Red, the CA24, for me, was the much better listen. Flipping over then to some classical music, and listening to Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, things were different once again. The CA24 was the first cab off the rank, and it sounded good. It sounded solid, enjoyable, completely listenable. I did feel like for this sort of orchestral recording, the mids and the lower treble was just a bit recessed. I wanted a bit more attack and a bit more bite from them, but it was a very minor complaint, and as I said, they were completely listenable. Once again, I was aware of the space and the sense of the soundstage from the CA24s, and it was once again quite left to right with fairly limited depth. And that on orchestral music can be a bit of a problem because it doesn't give enough space for good separation of the different sections of the orchestra. Not suggesting they should be all pulled apart and scattered, but there should generally be a sense of the strings being in front of the woodwinds and the brass, and then maybe timpanis and percussion. There wasn't really that sense. It was still like everything was laid out left to right, and therefore like the woodwinds, the brass, were kind of intermingled with the strings a little bit. It didn't sound congested or overly crowded. It just didn't give me the ability to hear the layers of the orchestra. Jumping over to the S12s, and now their much flatter overall tonal response pays dividends in the classical music. With the S12s, I had a better sense of that mid-range and upper treble attack. It made everything sound just a bit more open and a little bit clearer. What that also did was provide a greater sense of space in the overall presentation. And so even though the total overall soundstage size I would say is comparable between the two, and even though I don't feel like the S12 gave me any really greater sense of depth, I did feel like I was hearing better separation of all the individual sounds in the orchestra. Again, not breaking it apart, but just giving me a better sense of where in the musical landscape each sound was coming from. It wasn't a huge difference between the S12 and the CA24, and that's a testament to the fact that I think both of these earphones are fantastic options. At $140 US, I think you could easily have both of these or choose which one suits your personal preferences and be incredibly happy. I do think that if you lean towards more orchestral style music, where you want that better sense of texture and clarity in the upper mids, then the S12 probably is still the slightly better choice. But if you're looking for a more relaxed and engaging and enjoyable sound, particularly if you're listening to things like blues and rock, maybe some jazz depending on which subgenres you're looking at, then I do think the CA24 would be a fantastic choice. And so for me, what my time with the CA24 has shown me is that they're an IEM that I look forward to picking up and I look forward to listening to all sorts of music through. They're not a perfect IEM in the sense that they don't do absolutely everything as well as some alternatives, i.e. the S12, but they're definitely an IEM that I'll be keeping in my collection. If they sound like a good fit for your preferences and your musical tastes, I'll put a link down below through to Hi-Fi Go where you can go through, pick up a pair and say thank you to them for providing this set for me to review. Likewise, if the S12 sounds more like your cup of tea, check out the link through to the planar magnetic IEM review where you can hear a lot more about the S12 and how it compares to other IEMs like the 7Hz Timeless. If you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell and hit the like button. It really helps me to know what sort of videos you want to see more, and of course it will help YouTube to put those same sorts of videos in front of you. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.